You're camping deep in the woods, and somewhere past the tree line, something is moving. The first night, you tell yourself it's the wind, or a fox, and you go back to sleep without much trouble. The second night, the sound is closer, and you leave the lantern burning until it's light out. By the third night, you're sure of it. Whatever is out there hasn't wandered off. It's testing you, a little more each night, to see how you react. Now push that same feeling back roughly 40,000 years, into a limestone gorge in what is now the middle of England. Swap the lantern for a fire that has to be fed by hand, log by log, out of a woodpile that is not going to last forever. And swap whatever you were picturing in the dark for something built heavier and stronger than any predator alive in Britain today. This is the story of a small band who spent 3 nights figuring out exactly how much of that woodpile they were willing to burn just to stay alive. The gorge cut through pale limestone like an old wound, a shallow river threading along its floor between walls pocked with cave mouths and shallow rock shelters. Even in full daylight the air inside stayed cooler than the open ground above it, and sound carried strangely along the rock. A footstep or a cough at one end could sometimes be heard clearly at the other. The band had come here the way they came most years, following reindeer that funneled through this narrow stretch of ground on their way toward open country beyond it, mothers and new calves easy to track and easier to corner in a place this tight. 15 or 20 people, the very old and the very young included, made camp at the mouth of one of the larger shelters. 3 fires burned in a rough line at the entrance. Hides were stretched on frames to cure in the smoke. There was work enough to fill the hours before dark, the way there always was. Someone scraping a hide clean with a stone edge worked sharp that morning, someone else resetting the haft on a spear that had come loose 2 camps back, children too young to help with either staying close to the fires, underfoot more often than useful, while the oldest among the group kept half an eye on them without ever quite seeming to. That first day, before the light dropped low enough to worry about, the hunt itself went about as well as hunts in this gorge ever went. Word had passed up the gorge before midday that the herd was moving, dust first, then noise, then the animals themselves, strung out along the only path the walls allowed. The reindeer came through in a loose column, mothers pushing calves ahead of them, and the band worked together to turn a small group away from the main herd and into a dead-end fold of rock where escape meant climbing, not running. 2 animals came down. It was the kind of result that could feed this band, resting and traveling, for a good stretch of days. The reason bands kept returning to this exact gorge year after year, despite the caves lining its walls, and whatever occasionally denned inside them. That night, someone heard the calls, a long, rising whoop, answered a few seconds later from somewhere out past the tree line, where the gorge widened onto open plain. Nobody around the fire thought much of it. Hyenas denned in caves up and down this same gorge, using many of the same shelters the band used, just not at the same time of year, and the sound of them calling to each other across a kill or a boundary line was as ordinary here as wind moving through dry grass. The woman who had kept this band's fires longer than anyone else could remember, old enough to have outlasted 2 hard winters that others in the band hadn't, fed the flames a little higher anyway, out of habit more than worry. Then, one by one, the band went to sleep. What none of them had any way of knowing was that the voice answering from the tree line that night was not the same voice that had answered from roughly the same spot, at roughly the same hour, the night before. Somewhere in the past day, one animal had moved into ground that another had left. Natural bottlenecks like this gorge were some of the most valuable hunting ground a band could find. Driving a migrating herd into a narrow, walled passage, instead of chasing it across open plain, let a handful of hunters use the landscape itself to do most of the work. The young reindeer taken that day were not incidental. Sites in gorges like this one show an unusually high proportion of young animals among the bones left behind, a sign that bands timed their visits to catch herds at calving season, when the meat itself was different, and worth more to a band about to spend hard months on the move. A cave hyena was not a smaller, stranger version of today's hyenas, it was bigger. Adults averaged around 88 kilograms, some pushing past 100, roughly 60% heavier than their closest living relative, the spotted hyena of Africa. The calls this band heard likely worked the way a spotted hyena's whoop still works today, audible up to 5 kilometers away, carrying enough individual detail in its pitch that one caller can be told apart from another, the way you might recognize a particular neighbor's voice through a wall. By the second night, nobody needed convincing that something had changed. The whoop came again not long after dark, close enough now that 2 members of the band, a young hunter built more for endurance than raw size, quick enough on his feet that he was usually the one sent ahead to scout a trail, walked the edge of the firelight with a burning branch each, just to look. They went further than they meant to, past the point where the firelight still reached, following the sound rather than any trail they could see. and found, at the base of a rock face maybe 100 paces out, a scatter of old, sun-bleached bone that had clearly been lying there for longer than this band had been camped in the gorge. Somebody's den, used across more seasons than one. They didn't linger to look closer. They walked back toward the fire at a pace just short of running, and said less about what they'd actually found than either of them was thinking. Around the fire, the argument that night was short but real. Break camp now, while there was still enough daylight left to move safely, and lose the best hunting ground this band had found in a full turn of the seasons. Or stay, and answer whatever was testing the edges of camp with more fire than usual, night after night, for as long as it took. Which was worth more, the best hunting this band had found all season, or one more night without knowing exactly what was pacing along the tree line? They stayed. The firekeeper walked the length of the woodpile that evening and did the kind of counting that doesn't need words. Eyes moving over what was stacked, what was still green and slow to catch, what would burn fast and leave nothing by morning. A woman nursing the band's youngest child pulled the furs tighter around them both and moved her sleeping place in closer, near enough to the flames that the light caught on the child's face. Nobody said out loud what everyone in the group had already decided without a vote, that for however many nights this took, that fire was not going to be allowed to drop low, whatever it ended up costing them. A band this size, 15 to 20 people, sits close to what researchers estimate as a typical Neanderthal social group, based on both site layouts like this one and the low genetic diversity found within small family groups elsewhere in Europe. Fire itself was nothing new to them. In this same stretch of Britain, evidence of deliberately controlled fire stretches back roughly 400,000 years, among the oldest such evidence found anywhere on Earth. Morning brought a decision nobody wanted to make. Before anyone left to gather anything, the band did what it could to make the camp itself harder to get into. Loose stone and broken branch were dragged into a rough line across the shelter's open side, low enough to step over but enough to slow anything moving fast in the dark. Spears that had sat unused since the last real trouble this band had seen were pulled out and set within reach of the fire, points freshly checked. Two of the older children were given the job of keeping the youngest ones back against the cave wall, well behind the fires, and told plainly enough to understand it. Whatever happened, that was where they stayed. It was the firekeeper who insisted on the barrier, over some grumbling that it would slow their own movement down as much as anything else's. She had outlived enough bad nights to know that a few extra seconds spent working out how to get past an obstacle were seconds a band could use, and nobody with any sense argued with her twice. The woodpile itself, even fed carefully, would not survive 2 more nights burning at the height it had burned the night before, not without more coming in. And gathering wood meant leaving the shelter of the gorge floor, walking out along the very tree line the calls had been coming from, in daylight, when whatever was out there was more likely resting than hunting, but still close enough that nobody wanted to make the trip alone. They went in a group of 4, the young hunter among them, moving fast and staying loud on purpose, talking, calling out to each other, knocking wood against stone, because silence was for creatures that didn't want to be found, and this small group very much wanted to be heard, seen, and left alone. Halfway through, the young hunter stopped mid-stride and lifted a hand for quiet, a single, sharp sound from somewhere off to the left, gone before anyone could place it exactly. They stood still together for a long count of 10, saw nothing, heard nothing more, and went back to gathering, faster now, hands moving quicker than before. They came back within the hour, arms full of as much dry wood as 4 people could carry in a single trip, along with something none of them had gone out looking for. The scattered, broken remains of a young reindeer a short distance from camp, its long bones cracked open in a way no wolf's jaw and no human tool could manage cleanly. Nobody needed it explained. It settled, without a word passing between them, exactly what kind of animal had been circling this camp for 2 nights running. That evening, the fire went up higher than either of the 2 nights before it. Rock shelters like this one offered a real defensive advantage. Solid stone on 3 sides, leaving only the open mouth of the shelter, the fire, and whoever tended it, as the one approach worth watching. This landscape was mostly open steppe tundra, grass and low scrub grazed by reindeer, wild horse, and woolly rhinoceros, with few real stands of trees anywhere close to camp. Gathering enough fuel for one long, high-burning night took real planning ahead, not luck. The cracked open bones the group found were not a small detail. A cave hyena's jaw could split a fresh carcass for the marrow inside, something almost nothing else sharing this landscape could manage as easily. The 3rd night, nobody in the band pretended to be asleep. The calls started earlier than before, and closer, and this time there was more than one voice answering back. 2, maybe 3, moving along the tree line in a rough, restless line that never quite came into the firelight and never fully left it either. The firekeeper fed the flames without waiting to be asked, past the point of caution, burning in a single night wood that should by rights have lasted two. Twice, low pairs of eyes caught the firelight at the very edge of where it reached and then vanished again before anyone could be sure of what they'd seen. Each time, the whole camp went still, waiting to find out whether stillness would be enough. For a long stretch of hours after that, nothing happened beyond the sound itself. Whoops, and closer in, something lower and more like a chattering laugh, moving unseen along the dark side of the light. Children were kept in close, between the adults and the fire rather than near the edges of the shelter. Then, near the point where the firelight gave out to full dark, one shape came in low and fast toward the drying racks, toward meat hung at almost exactly the height an animal that size could reach without much effort at all. The young hunter was already closer to the racks than to the fire, and he did the only thing that made sense with nothing else in his hands. Grabbed a burning branch straight out of the nearest flame and swung it hard into the dark, shouting as loudly as his lungs would let him. Whether it was the fire, the noise, or simply the fact that reaching those racks was no longer going to be quiet or easy, the shape peeled off and back into the tree line before anyone could see it clearly enough to know exactly what they had been facing. The whooping continued for close to another hour, moving further off each time it returned, and then, sometime after the deepest, darkest part of the night had already passed, it stopped and did not start again before dawn. Not everyone agreed, afterward, that rushing toward the racks with fire in hand had been the right call. The firekeeper, in particular, pointed out sharply that they now had one fewer person near the flames at exactly the moment it mattered most, and that one very lucky outcome does not make a reckless choice a good one. The disagreement didn't get settled that night. It didn't need to. Everyone was still there in the morning to keep having it. That fear was not invented from nothing. In a cave near Rome, in Italy, archaeologists found the remains of 9 Neanderthals, 1 woman, 7 men, a boy, killed elsewhere and dragged there over tens of thousands of years by hyenas using the cave as their den. Researchers studying the site found the hyenas had specifically targeted the most vulnerable individuals available, the sick, the very young, the old. Different place, and mostly an earlier stretch of time. Not proof of what happened in this gorge on this exact night, but proof the fear itself was grounded in something real. By the time real daylight came back into the gorge, the band had burned through nearly everything they had gathered in the past 2 days combined, and nobody had slept in any way that counted as rest. But the racks were untouched. The camp itself was intact. And when the firekeeper's eyes moved across the group the way they had moved across the woodpile 3 nights running, the count came back to the same number the band had started with. For a group this size, in a place this exposed, that was not a small thing to be able to say. Someone started laughing for no clear reason, the kind of laughter that comes out sideways after real fear rather than from anything actually funny, and for a moment it moved through the whole tired group before settling back into quiet. They didn't leave immediately. The reindeer were still moving through the gorge in good numbers, and 3 frightening nights, on their own, were not quite reason enough to walk away from the best hunting this band had found all season. But over the following days, once enough meat and hide had been taken to make the risk worth what it had already cost them, they packed what they could carry and moved on, following the herds out toward open ground, leaving the gorge and its caves behind them, to whatever was still denning somewhere in the dark at the far end of it. That ending, moving on instead of staying to fight permanently for the ground, matches what caves in gorges like this one actually preserve, not one single owner, but a rotation. Some layers show years of hyena denning. Other layers show small human bands instead, back and forth, sometimes separated by decades or centuries between one and the next. Neither side occupied these shelters without interruption, and neither drove the other out for good. That band was not the only one to make this exact trade. Other small groups came through this same gorge for a long stretch of years afterward, following the same migrating herds, camping in the same handful of shelters, listening for the same calls in the dark, and running the same nightly calculations about wood and fire and how close was too close to ignore. Some years the hyenas denned deeper in the caves and the calls stayed distant all season, barely worth mentioning around the fire. Other years, for reasons nobody camped there could have explained, the calls came in closer again, and the fires burned higher again, and small bands like this one got through it exactly the way this one had, carefully, together, one night at a time. None of it ever became routine, exactly. Every band that came through knew the same stories the others had passed down about bad years and good ones, and every band still counted its woodpile by hand on the first uneasy night, the same as this one had. Generation folded into generation this way, the gorge itself barely changing while everything inside it, the exact families, the exact fires, the exact voices answering from the tree line, turned over again and again. Then, within some thousands of years of that particular night by that particular fire, Something changed in this gorge that had nothing to do with hyenas at all. The people making camp here stopped being Neanderthals. The best evidence from this exact gorge, a real place on the Derbyshire-Nottinghamshire border known today as Creswell Crags, home to the densest concentration of Neanderthal archaeology found anywhere in Britain, places Neanderthal use of these caves at roughly 60,000 to 40,000 years ago. That puts a night like this one right at the tail end of the known window, in the same broad era when Neanderthals disappear from the archaeological record across Europe. Why, exactly? There is still no single answer researchers agree on. It would be many thousands of years more before a different kind of human returned to make camp in these same caves at all. You will probably never have to ration firewood against a hyena clan testing the edge of your camp. But the next time you're somewhere dark, and something makes a sound you can't quite place, and some old, wordless part of you sits up and starts listening for whether it comes back closer, that isn't paranoia talking. That instinct is doing exactly the job it was built to do roughly 40,000 years ago, in a limestone gorge, around a fire that a handful of people were simply not going to let go out.